Kant, Immanuel, German philosopher, born in Königsberg, East Prussia, on April 22, 1724. He passed away there on February 12, 1804. Kant's father, Johann Georg Kant, was a poor but respected saddler. The home atmosphere of strict Pietistic Protestantism left a lasting impression upon Kant and is reflected in the rigorism of his moral doctrine. The young Kant attended the Collegium Fridericianum, where he received a thorough training in Latin. But Kant always remembered with horror the fanatical discipline characteristic of this school. When later, in his lectures on pedagogy, Kant emphasized that one ought to educate children in freedom so that they can be of a happy heart, he was reacting to the quite different experience of his own childhood. At age 16, Kant entered the University of Königsberg, where he studied philosophy, mathematics and physics, and attended lectures in theology. When 5 years later his father died, Kant found himself in financial difficulties which delayed until 1749 his publication of his first scientific work, Thoughts Concerning a True Estimation of the Vital Forces, and made it necessary for him to serve 9 years, until 1755, as a private tutor with various families in the vicinity of Königsberg. However, during this period Kant not only acquired the social graces which later distinguished him, but also accumulated an astounding knowledge in many fields, and his thoughts matured. He published a few brief papers and then, in 1755, anonymously, his famous General History of Nature and Theory of the Heavens. In the same year, Kant received his doctor's degree and became a lecturer at the University of Königsberg. He taught logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, natural theology and anthropology, as well as mathematics, physics, and physical geography. In 1770, upon submitting his inaugural dissertation on the form and principles of the sensible and intelligible world, he was appointed professor of logic and metaphysics at Königsberg. Before he retired, in 1786, Kant had been dean of the faculty 6 times and rector of the university twice. After a long pause in publication, Kant completed in quick succession the great works which have become classics in philosophy: Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, Prolegomena to any future metaphysic in 1783, Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science in 1785, Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, Critique of Judgment in 1790, Religion Within the Limits of Pure Reason in 1793, and Metaphysics of Morals in 1797. Earlier works include General History of Nature and Theory of the Heavens in 1755, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, Explained Through the Dreams of Metaphysics in 1766, and Concerning the Structure and the Mechanical Origin of the Whole Universe. Only once was Kant's continuity interrupted when Johann Christian von Wöllner, minister to Frederick William II of Prussia, ordered the 70-year-old philosopher to refrain from writing about or lecturing on religion. Kant wrote a reply justifying his position but obeyed the order. Kant was neither asocial nor detached from the events of the day. The pedantic orderliness of his daily life was the result of a rigid self-discipline to preserve his strength and not to overtax his frail health. Kant's critical philosophy was the result of a long development during which he came successively under the influence of Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, Christian von Wolff, Sir Isaac Newton, John Locke, David Hume, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and once more, Leibniz and Hume. The dividing mark between Kant's pre-critical and critical philosophy is the year 1769. In the early 1760s, Kant still accepted the dogmatic rationalism of philosophical tradition, the culmination of which he saw in Newtonian mechanics and in the metaphysics of Leibniz and Wolff. Using our solar system as an example, Kant tries to show how, under the influence of attraction and repulsion, and in conformity with Newtonian principles, the whole universe can be developed out of an initially given cosmic dust, known as Kant's nebular hypothesis of the origin of the solar system. Philosophically significant here are Kant's strict adherence to the principle of mechanical causation and the absence of metaphysical speculation. Kant is convinced, however, that the manifest purposiveness of all vital processes remains inexplicable in terms of causality alone. At this time, Kant's thinking was still dominated by the rationalism of Leibniz and Wolff, according to which conceptual analysis by itself yields true knowledge of the very nature of things. However, under the influence of Locke and Hume, Kant came to understand that logical operations, although sufficient for the organization of knowledge, contribute nothing to the content of knowledge, which is derived from experience alone. Following Hume, he distinguished now between logical ground, ratio, and real ground, causa. But whereas Hume repudiated the principle of causality as a deception of our imagination, Kant retained it as a constitutive principle of nature. The result of these new insights led Kant to that attack upon traditional metaphysics, which is the philosophical core of the dreams of a spirit seer. Reacting to the metaphysical speculations of Immanuel Swedenborg, Kant shows how easy it is, through a clever use of mere conceptual possibilities, to create the impression of knowledge of a supersensible world. Since metaphysics cannot penetrate to the ultimately real, Kant now argues, its only legitimate task is the comprehension of the nature and limitations of human cognition. The aim of critical philosophy thus appears for the first time. The year 1769 brought Kant a great new insight into the crucial distinction between the world of sense and the world of understanding, and hence into a corresponding distinction in the structure of knowledge. This new insight was induced by Kant's realization of the full significance of the problem involved in the applicability of mathematics to the physical world. More specifically, how can the independence and apodictic validity of mathematical proof be reconciled with the applicability of mathematics to the world of things? Kant's solution of this problem, as presented in the dissertation of 1770, is that space and time are neither mere concepts of relation, as Leibniz held, nor metaphysical entities as Newton maintained, but forms of our sensibility under which alone sense impressions can be experienced by us. Following Leibniz, Kant now distinguishes between the world of appearance, which corresponds to our senses, and the world of true being, which corresponds to our understanding and reason. And again following Leibniz, he accepts the rationalistic dogmatic thesis that, whereas sense impressions reveal the things as they appear to us, the concepts of the understanding reveal them as they are. However, a renewed study of Hume now led Kant to a final repudiation of speculative metaphysics, and to the development of his own critical philosophy. Kant never doubted the validity of the basic principles of mathematics and physics. He realized that Hume's position, consistently followed through, must lead to skepticism not only with respect to metaphysics, but with respect to the natural sciences as well. He was therefore forced to re-examine the position he himself had taken in 1770. His problem was to reconcile that which he inherited from Hume's skepticism with the postulate of a necessarily and universally valid cognition in the exact natural sciences. Conceived in its broadest sense, the problem became, for Kant, the problem of the possibility of an objectively valid cognition as such. The key to Kant's critical solution of this problem lies in his method of analysis, which is neither psychogenetic nor merely logical. It is a method which makes cognition itself the subject matter of inquiry, aiming at the disclosure of the critical conditions which make valid cognition possible. Kant called it the transcendental method. He was convinced that certain judgments, which he called synthetic a priori, are the indispensable presuppositions of all sciences. These judgments are synthetic insofar as they contribute to the content of knowledge, as do empirical judgments, and they are a priori because they are necessarily and universally valid, as are analytic judgments. Kant's specific problem is, therefore, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? His solution is that sense impressions and our understanding are independent but supplementary sources of knowledge, that true knowledge is found only where both contribute to it, and that whatever our senses and our understanding contribute to knowledge is preconditioned by the forms of sensibility, space and time, and by the categories of our understanding, quantity, relation, modality, and their subforms. Synthetic a priori judgments are rooted in those forms and categories, and are therefore valid for every object which appears under the forms of our sensibility or is thought of in terms of the categories of our understanding. Kant believed that the critique of pure reason demolished all speculative metaphysics and natural theology, but provided a dependable foundation for science. His conclusion was that cognition is restricted to the realm of phenomena, that we can know nothing which cannot be given through our senses, but that within these limitations we may have valid empirical knowledge, derived from observation and culminating in the special laws of nature, and a cognition a priori of the universal conditions which make nature itself and a science of nature possible. The empirical knowledge of special laws is the proper province of the scientist. The cognition a priori is that of the philosopher of nature. Kant dealt with this in his Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. His first step beyond the conclusions of the Critique of Pure Reason was the introduction of the empirical concept of matter, by applying the category substance to the appearances of the outer sense, space. Initially, matter was for Kant a movable substance in space. However, this concept gradually gave way in Kant's thinking to that of force, for matter does not simply occupy space but occupies it under the dynamic aspects of attraction and repulsion. Repudiating the atomism of his time, Kant thus accepted a theory of the dynamic continuity of forces. But it follows from the principle of causality that every change of a material body in space must have a cause external to itself. The transition from rest into motion and from motion into rest must therefore have an external cause, and this fact logically implies the law of inertia. Furthermore, it follows from the category interaction and the law of inertia that, in the transmission of motion, action and counteraction must always be equal. Kant thus shows that the whole of Newtonian mechanics can be derived a priori from the transcendental conditions of the empirical cognition as such. Although the universal principles of critique, being the indispensable conditions of the possibility of cognition, must hold for the realm of living beings no less than for the rest of the universe, they are not in themselves sufficient to explain the phenomena of life. A mechanics of a blade of grass is impossible. Hence the concept of teleology must supplement the categories of the understanding. For Kant, however, teleology is merely an auxiliary principle which is applied whenever the causal relation as such is not clear, unless the idea of the effect is regarded as determining the cause, that is, when what is can be understood only in terms of what is to be. The idea of teleology is useful when we deal with processes in the living organism, or with nature as a whole. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant developed these ideas at length. With respect to the living organism, Kant's point is that the organism as a whole is determined by the structure and function of its parts, while at the same time the structure and function of the parts is determined by the organism as a whole. This interaction of parts and whole constitutes an insurmountable obstacle for any interpretation of nature, such as the mechanistic, which is restricted to a one-dimensional causal sequence. Life is thus a boundary concept which delimits the sufficiency of a mechanistic view of the world. Still, Kant hoped that a principle of genetic development, evolution, might enable us to understand the development of species from some original form of life. With respect to nature as a whole, Kant saw the need for a teleological approach in the interdependence of the specific laws of nature which, taken together, constitute an all-inclusive system. This system of nature cannot be known a priori, nor is it empirically demonstrable, for nothing can be demonstrated empirically about nature as a whole. But to think of nature and the world order as if they were the achievement of an infinitely intelligent being, that is to think of them in terms of an ultimate purpose, might greatly aid our understanding of them. In Kant's opinion, however, the only purpose which, being ultimate, can also be an end for everything else must be a being capable of positioning for itself unconditionally some goals or ends. Only a human being, as moral person, fulfills this requirement. To make possible the existence of moral beings living under moral laws may thus be regarded as the highest purpose of nature. At this point, the crucial question of critical philosophy arises in a new form. Are there laws which determine man's volition in an a priori manner, and wherein is grounded their claim to universal validity? Kant holds that the existence of such laws is disclosed in the value judgments pertaining to the conditions of human volition. He finds, however, that two kinds of such judgments are possible, namely, judgments of usefulness, which are conditional and therefore not universally valid, and moral judgments which at least claim universal and unconditional validity. This claim to unconditional validity is justifiable only in terms of some universal norm which is valid for all rational beings, and such a norm, according to Kant, is the moral law. Upon the all-encompassing background of universal natural laws, there arises thus a narrower realm of moral laws. Now a law of nature states what, under specified conditions, must occur, and what therefore actually occurs. The moral law, on the other hand, demands what ought to occur, irrespective of whether or not it actually does occur. The question concerning the existence and validity of a priori laws in the sphere of morality thus leads at once to the question of the nature of moral laws and the possibility of reconciling them with the laws of nature. And this question in turn leads to the problem of free will, the basic problem of critical ethics. Kant holds that the moral value of an act stems exclusively from the inner attitude of the person, that is, it stems from the maxim which determines the action. However, if the maxim is merely subjective, then it cannot be a moral law. This means that a maxim takes on the character of a law only when all elements which may vary from person to person and situation to situation, and which are only empirically determinable, are eliminated from consideration. Even an attempt to derive the moral law from a universal self-love must fail because self-love leads at best to hypothetical imperatives of the form. If you desire such and such a goal, then you must do so and so. Such imperatives are at best counsels of prudence. They are not moral laws. But if all material determinations of the will are unsuitable as foundation for the moral law, then the criterion of such a law can lie only in its form. As Kant put it, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. A law, however, which can wish to be valid universally, has the character of a law of nature. Hence Kant's second formulation, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. It follows that for Kant, the moral worth of a person is determined, not by what that person does, but by the spirit in which he does it. It is impossible to conceive anything in the world or even out of it, which can be taken as good, without limitation, save only a good will.